vice chair of the board. I chair Commissioner Mejia is excused today. To my left is Commissioner Ray Edwards, and to his left is County Manager Chavez. To my right is Assistant County Manager Robert Campbell. We have CPEG staffers here for a work session on Thurston 2045 scope of work briefing related to the comprehensive plan. Public virtual things you follow along the Thurston County YouTube channel. Josh Cummings, Director of Community Planning and Economic Development. Chris Coe, welcome, and turning the baton straight to Josh.
Yeah, Josh. Great. Thank you, Commissioners. Appreciate this opportunity. If you'll recall, the comprehensive plan conversation is one that we do on a regular basis. When I first came into this role, the Commissioners directed our staff to get back on the tracks with the comprehensive plan in accordance with the Growth Management Act and the Washington State Department of Commerce. We were overdue by years at that time, and we were able to get the comprehensive plan back on track. And so I really appreciate the hard work of staff and the Planning Commission that got us to this place where now we can have these regular updates, and this is timely. So we're in time and timely, and wanted to make sure that we're bringing these items to you in a way that provides an opportunity for the public process and for your input as we build this next iteration of the comprehensive plan. So what you'll hear today is, we have an hour-long briefing to kind of set the stage and then talk about next steps, potential options from the board, and some of the information that the Planning Commission has recommended as well. So I'll turn it over to Chris and Mike, but just wanted to again say appreciate it and glad to be back on track with the topic.
So this briefing is not, there's no decision required at this briefing, it's informational only. And we're bringing this information to you all for you to digest that information and ask questions. Early April, we'll bring back all of the information for the session. You'll notice that there are several required updates that need to be completed, as well as a few optional items. And these optional items have been added based on citizen input. For example, the climate change element, and that's an optional item. Optional items have also been added as an eye to the process improvement. We've heard a lot about creating less bureaucracy or streamlining the path for applicants to put projects on the ground faster. So you'll see that in the industrial lands study findings information and official land use map changes. And lastly, there are budget implications. So yes, the governor's office and the legislature made a historic investment in the Growth Management Act planning in the 2022 legislative update, there's a dedicated session. And Commerce will be making the grant funding available about $700,000 we expect here as of July. But the scope of work that counties put together, staff has put together based on that citizen input exceeds that $700,000. So there are some areas that we do need some decision made by the board. Anna, you want to go ahead and start with the presentation?
Maybe if you're going to cover it in the presentation, disregard this, but can you just orient us in terms of, we did like the core chapter updates, but there were some chapters that we left, and maybe some of them we didn't tackle, I can't quite remember. And then how does this fit into that?
Sure. So in 2019, we completed a comprehensive plan update, which was acquired in 2016, and that was the core elements. In 2020, we finished some of the optional items the previous boards had requested that we update, like the economic chapter and the first chapter, the health chapter. Some of those were completed in 2020. We moved some of the joint planning off to the 2022 annual amendments, and we're still working through those. And now we're at the next required periodic update. So we went back and we looked through, and I will go through this, the legislative changes that are necessary for us to add to make amendments to a comprehensive plan. Those are required elements. What those are, as well as, like I said, there will be some optional elements as well.
So back to your question, that's what I was talking to at the very beginning, getting the comprehensive plan back on track. There were the core items, The core is the required chapters by Department of Commerce. Those got back on track in 2019. The board made a decision to separate the required from the optional. So the 2019 core got back on track at that time, and then the optionals got back on track on 2020. We decided to, like Chris said, take that third piece, the joint plans, and we're working through those right now. So that's what I'm saying when the comprehensive plan is back on the tracks. Now we're deciding what to load the train with, and that's this conversation.
The main thing is we didn't leave any chapter hanging.
Correct.
We did not.
Kind of like catching the tail.
Nope.
Tree catching its own tail.
Nope.
So I couldn't remember if we'd actually gotten through
Got it done.
those optionals that we left in 2019.
Absolutely.
Huge success.
Okay, great.
Maya, go for it.
Great, thank you. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
I am having a little bit of trouble hearing some of the commissioners speaking in the room, so I will try to hear your questions carefully. But we have an hour-long briefing today to go over the comprehensive plan periodic update, and we are referring to this as Thurston 2045, and this is the scoping discussion. So as Josh said, what do we want to load on the train as we move this project forward? I have a brief PowerPoint, and I'm going to ask that questions be held until the end, and then we'll have plenty of time to work through those questions. So today's briefing will go over the comprehensive plan periodic update, just a very brief what it is and why we do it, and then we'll dive into a draft scope of work as well as a timeline for the project moving forward. We're not requesting direction at this briefing today. We have a follow-up briefing scheduled on April 12th, and we'll be requesting direction from the board on which optional updates to include at that follow-up briefing. So you have some time to think about it and ask questions as needed. A little bit of background, the county is required to periodically update our comprehensive plan and our development regulations to comply with any changes that have happened in state law. So our most recent comprehensive plan periodic update was in 2019. That was the year we completed. And then we had a couple of follow-on items that we finished up in 2020. So that was the last periodic update that we completed. It was actually due in 2016, and we just finished it a little bit later. But we're back on track. The next comp plan update is due in 2025, June 30th of that year. And this is the big overarching update. As I said, it brings the plan up to date with recent changes in state law. It updates land use numbers, population projections, building projections, and it plans for the next 20 years out, so looking out to the 2045 horizon. This is not a full repeal and replace, and it's not a full revisioning of the plan. So we do have a vision that has withstood time. We'll update as needed based on public feedback, but we don't go and take the whole plan apart and redo it. We're really going in and doing targeted updates to it. So in Thurston County, we have annual amendments, and these are a little bit different than the periodic amendments. I just want to go through the differences of the two. The annual amendment process is an optional process that jurisdictions can take on, and this is the pathway for community members to request changes to the comprehensive plan and the development code, and we accept those applications on an ongoing basis. So someone can come in at any time of year and request that their land use and zoning be changed on their property. And those come forward to the board early the following year, and that's what makes up most of our 2-year dockets and the amendments. And then those are prioritized by the board. So that annual amendment process is optional. Counties don't have to do that. But the periodic update, which is once every 10 years, it was previously once every 8 years. That's the big update where we have to bring everything up to speed with state law. And that's a requirement. All jurisdictions have to do the periodic updates if they're planning under the Growth Management Act. Those items also get added to the docket. It's typically one big project item that falls under periodic update to the comprehensive plan, and it includes lots of changes to not only the comprehensive plan but development regulations. So both of these types of amendments, the county can only take an action to change the comprehensive plan once per year, and that's under state law. So that's what docketing falls in, and we do those changes typically at the end of each year, but the June one will fall probably in June of 2025. So what is a comprehensive plan? This is the set of guiding principles and policies that creates the vision for the county, the rural area of Thurston County, and it guides how and when development occurs. It also has guiding principles for economic development, preservation of environmental areas, transportation, and other planning issues like that. And there are 13 planning goals under State Law Growth Management Act. Those range from concentrating urban growth to reducing sprawl, planning land uses where facilities will exist for urban types of uses, encouraging efficient transportation systems, planning and accommodating housing, encouraging economic development, and promoting opportunity for regional differences, protecting property rights, processing permits in a timely manner, and then goals around environmental protection and public services and facilities, and also historic preservation. So those are the goals that guide the comprehensive plan, and a lot of these things might be considered competing uses. So it is a little bit of a balancing act. We are balancing environment, economic development, land uses, property rights, and all of those pieces come into play in the comprehensive plan. So Thurston County's comprehensive plan has 13 chapters, and then there are also several appendices that I did not include on this side. And the required elements under state law are either typically a chapter or they touch several chapters. So an example is the transportation element. That is a specific chapter in our comprehensive plan. And then another example would be a rural lands element. In Thurston County, that touches several chapters. It touches our land use chapter, our natural resource lands chapter, and we are meeting all of the required elements under state law. And there are some updates that we will have to do in the upcoming years that I will go over shortly. Our public participation plan was included in your briefing packet, and this is intended as a high-level document that outlines the major stages for public engagement opportunities for our community. It is not meant to be an extremely detailed plan with all of the locations yet, because as we move through this process, that will grow and change. But the main goals of the comprehensive plan update and the public participation plan are to make sure that information is accessible, to bring awareness to the community of the changes, and to provide the community opportunities to give input and speak to decision makers on the changes. And we're proposing to do that through a variety of methods along the way. Some of these are our typical methods, like public hearings, written comment periods, planning commission meetings, board of county commissioner meetings. All of those are things that we typically do. For the comprehensive plan update, we will also do surveys, open houses. We might go out for a community roadshow where we have several locations in the county that we go speak to folks. And then typically there are a lot of one-on-one meetings and then meetings with specific stakeholder groups for items that they might be specifically interested in. And then we can tailor the presentations to cover the updates that they are most affected by and they want to hear about most. Reaching underrepresented groups is a big piece of this comp plan update. So community planning does strive to prioritize engagement with typically underrepresented communities and community members that have historically been left out of the planning process. That includes renters, people who live with disabilities, immigrants, BIPOC-led organizations, and we hope that the resulting plan will be well-rounded and it includes experiences of all these different perspectives and people who have historically not been included in the public participation process. We also want to acknowledge that there is a new House Bill 1717 for tribal participation. We've already engaged with the tribes about this update so that they are aware that it's upcoming and they have the option to do kind of an MOU process if they so choose, but they will stay in the loop and we can keep them in the loop otherwise. And then we are implementing some strategies that we haven't used for previous comp plan updates, like including surveys and flyers in additional languages that are the most common languages in Thurston County by the census data. So we have done flyers in English, Spanish, Vietnamese, and then Korean. And then Spanish and Vietnamese are the next two two most popular languages in Thurston County following English. We also translated a survey to all those other languages in the late part of last year that went out to the community. And then we hope to connect more individually with stakeholder groups. So as I mentioned, the one-on-one meetings and the stakeholder group meetings are a big part of the periodic update process. And that is one area where we hope to reach out to groups that have typically been underrepresented through these types of planning processes. There might be components of outreach that get outsourced depending on budget for the comprehensive plan periodic update. So it's not necessarily something that will be done entirely in-house. There might be pieces of this that can get farmed out for extra help with. So going through the required and the optional updates, a little bit about how the scope of work was developed. The first piece that feeds into the draft scope of work is the Commerce Critical Areas and Fully Planning Counties checklists. And these serve as the basis, so these outline all of the changes in state law and the pieces that we are required to include in our comprehensive plan. And it's basically a list that we just go through and we check off if there might be changes needed, further investigation is needed, or we're already meeting that criteria. So that serves as the basis, and we can identify what changes we're needing to meet state law. We also considered public comments and the priorities of the community, and to do that, we held a survey that went out to the community for 2 months at the end of last year, and we took that feedback to help develop some of the optional updates that are included before you today. And then we consider anticipated changes to state law. So some of the optional updates are aligned with things that we expect may come down from the legislature soon, and also considering local trends in Thurston County. So taking a very quick look at the survey, the full survey report is included in your packet, but I want to go over kind of the big takeaway from that survey. So we held a survey from November 1st to December 31st for 2 months, and it had 18 questions that were a range of multiple choice, ranking, and also free response. We got 950 survey responses, and 98% of those were in English, and then roughly 1% in Spanish and 1% in Russian. And one of the questions that we asked was for folks who were taking the survey to identify their 3 major priorities in the community. And from that, we identified the top 4 items that were most selected by respondents of the survey. And those were protecting sensitive areas, preparing for climate change, protecting agriculture, and increasing availability of affordable housing. There were a number of other items that were also selected, some things around healthcare, transportation, but these were the ones that really stood out as the top 4. And we did hear a lot about climate change and protecting the environment also through the free response section. Written public comments. We have started to receive public comments from the community on the periodic update. Some of these are specific changes that folks are requesting be done in the plan. We're not quite to that stage yet. We haven't started editing the plan. We're really just trying to set a scope at this time. But some of the comments that we are receiving are related to scope of work, and I will touch on those today at this briefing. So the one thing that we have heard from the community is to include the Planning Commission in the decision-making process for the scope. And we are currently reviewing the scope of work with the Planning Commission. So we did hold a work session back on February 15th, and we'll be bringing it back on March 15th to ask the Planning Commission for a recommendation on the optional updates as part of the scope of work. So we heard the community's feedback. We're involving the Planning Commission in that process to review the scope of work, and then we'll bring that recommendation back to the board in April. The other things that we're hearing from the community, some of these align with some of the things that we'll be required to do anyways, and then I'll touch on which ones are part of the optional updates. So support for a robust community engagement effort that looks into targeting and outreach to underrepresented groups. That's something that we will do regardless. We've received a lot of comments that request that we update the plan to meet housing needs. That's also a requirement that we will have to do as part of this update. And then there are also some comments about language, including language on climate mitigation and resiliency. We've included that as an optional update, and some other metrics about other comments about environmental justice, addressing racial disparities, including measurable metrics for an implementation plan, and considering updates to the countywide planning policies. And these are the major themes that we've heard in comments related to the scoping process. And the full packet of comments is provided in the back of the attachment packet. So going over required updates, these are updates that are needed to meet changes in state law, and there are also updates needed to bring the plan in alignment with recent changes to other planning documents. So running through this list very quickly, we have a land use element that will get updated population and building estimates. We also use the buildable lands report to feed into looking at land supply in that element. The natural resources element will be updated, housing element, capital facilities element, utilities element, rural element, transportation, parks and recreation. We have some land use and zoning corrections that we do just as part of the periodic update. That's for cleanup for the county. The joint plan updates that won't get finished are the Tenino and Rainier, and so those will be included as part of this comp plan update. And then any changes that are needed to the development regulations in order to meet changes to state law. So the big ones that are going to be a lot of work out of this list for the required updates are the housing element, and then the land use element and the transportation element also require some elbow grease. But the housing element has had a lot of recent changes in state law in the recent years, and that will be a big lift in terms of things we need to do to meet those changes in state law. So this is all included in the scope of work. We're required to do these things as part of the periodic update. And now I'll go over the list of optional updates. These are things that are not required to meet state law, but they might add value to the update. So this list we've developed based on community priorities, anticipated changes in state law, local trends, or process changes that could streamline the process for applicants. So the optional updates is really what we're going to be asking the Board of County Commissioners to provide direction on, and we will be looking for direction on which of the optional updates, if not all of them, to include in the periodic update. So there are 6 of these, and I will walk through each one in a little bit more detail. So the implementation plan, there are new changes in state law that require jurisdictions to do a 5-year progress report after the adoption of the periodic update. So our periodic update is due in 2025. And then in 2030, we will have to do a progress report on whether we are meeting those new goals and policies, particularly around changes in state law, like the changes with the housing element. So an implementation plan would basically be a new appendix that would get added to the comp plan, and it would develop a plan for action to implement the goals and policies. Specific actions we can take, measures, metrics, and ways that we can track how we're doing to meet those policies. And then this will help set the stage for that 5-year progress report. So this may ease up some of the work that comes with the 5-year progress report and really plan and prepare for that. The future land use update, this is an optional update that would streamline processes for applicants, and this is based on local trends that we're seeing and also just improving our process for the residents of Thurston County. So what this update would do would update the future land use map to create designations that are broad and general and serve as kind of big buckets that multiple zones can fall into. And what this does is it results in a procedural change for how some, not all, but some site-specific rezone requests are reviewed. So it would make that process quicker and less costly for some applicants because certain types of rezones would no longer require a land use change. And so they could be reviewed as a quasi-judicial amendment and not a legislative amendment. They wouldn't need a change to the comprehensive plan. So then they wouldn't need to go through docketing, they wouldn't need to go through planning commission review, and also Board of County Commissioner review. They would be a application for a rezone and go through the hearing examiner. So much quicker process. And just to give kind of an example of what that looks like, we might have one land use category for residential and then several zones that fall into that. Residential 1 to 20, 1 to 10, 1 to 5. And if a landowner is in that residential land use and their land is 1 to 10 and they want to go 1 to 5, they could then take that hearing examiner route for a rezone application. So it's a different type of process. But it doesn't necessarily apply to every single request. So if someone is residential and they want to change their land to industrial, that would still require a comprehensive plan amendment, and that would still need to go through docketing, review with the Planning Commission, and review with the board. So it really creates two separate categories. For the smaller rezone requests, it's a much quicker process. And this update would pair very well with a countywide industrial land study and incorporating new information that comes out of that study. So the next one is the industrial land study. We do have that as a current docket item to conduct the study, and we're expecting results from that study later this year. And this would incorporate the findings from that study into the periodic update and then be reviewed through that Planning Commission and board process. So we don't know what the results of that study are going to be yet, but it could include anything from land use and zoning changes, policy changes, updates to the Thurston County Code, things like that. So the study has been a priority of the community, and this would provide a pathway to incorporate the findings from that study. The climate change element. So this was identified as one of the highest priorities through the survey that we held and also in the public comments that we received from the community to be included and incorporated into the scope for this periodic update. It's not currently a requirement under state law, but it's been kind of on the billet for the last several legislative sessions, and we expect that it may be added as a required element soon. We've incorporated some of the work, but not all of the work from the Thurston Climate Mitigation Plan, and this would build off of that existing work. So we'd add goals and policies related to climate mitigation and resiliency, greenhouse gas inventory would be included, and there would be some additional hazard planning information. The economic element, so we do have an economic chapter in our comprehensive plan. This specific element had a very robust update that was done by the Economic Development Council in 2019. And this optional update would review and revise that work based on anything new that's happened in the community. Since this was so recently updated, we don't know how much work there is to be done here. There might be some new things to be added, but we're not entirely sure. But if pieces of this chapter need to be touched because of other updates like climate, transportation, the countywide industrial land study, we can address all of that even if this is not included as an optional update. So pieces that are intertwined with that would still get updated if they are included in the scope. And then the health element, like the economic chapter, this chapter had a pretty robust update done in 2019. I think we actually adopted this one in 2020, so it was one of those follow-on chapters. And we worked with Public Health and Social Services to do that update and incorporate information from Thurston Thrives and all of the recent studies that they had. Again, not sure how much new information there is to be added in here. And if there are pieces of this chapter that need updates based on other elements like climate or transportation, we would still be able to go in and do those tweaks, even if this is not included as part of the scope. So budget considerations for the board as you are thinking about which optional updates to include in the scope of work. For our required updates that are part of the periodic update, we're estimating about 2.5 staff. and $690,000 for professional services funding. There is a $700,000 grant opportunity through the state that could potentially cover all of that professional services funding for the required updates. For the optional updates, we're estimating about 3/4 of an employee to do some of that work and an additional $220,000 of professional services funding. So most of that would need to come out of general fund for professional services, about 210. And that number will vary depending on which optional updates are included and which aren't. So if not all of the optional updates are included, then this 210 figure will drop. I do also want to note that these are the same staff, this 2.5 and 3/4 time employees. Those are the same people that work on the docket items. So any additional staff that is dedicated to the periodic update will take people off of those individual requests that are currently on the docket. So it's a little bit of a balancing act. We work at the priorities of the board, but the same staff works on the periodic update as well as those docket amendments. Short-term timeline, as I mentioned, on February 15th, we introduced the scope of work with our Planning Commission. We have today's briefing with the Board of County Commissioners, March 1st, and then March 15th, we'll be returning to the Planning Commission to bring back survey information and request a recommendation on which optional updates be included. Then we'll be returning to the board on the 12th of April, and that's when we will be requesting for direction from the board on which optional updates to include in the scope of work. And at that time, we'll provide the Planning Commission recommendation if there is one. In May, we hope to bring forward a resolution with the final Thurston 2045 scope of work, and all of that is leading up to community planning applying for the grant funding to complete this periodic update work. Again, $700,000 grant funding that we will apply for on the 1st of July of this year. So the bigger picture timeline, some work will occur in the second half of this year. Most of that's going to be kind of internal outreach with stakeholders and just getting pieces of the chapters together, maybe looking for professional services for certain pieces of this plan update. And then the Planning Commission review, we expect to begin in spring of next year. So spring of 2024, that will probably take most of 2024. And then the board's review will begin late 2024, leading to that June 2025 final action by the board. So as I said, we have that follow-up briefing on April 12th, but today I'm happy to answer any questions you have on the presentation.
I'm sure we both have several, so we'll just kind of bounce back and forth. Commissioner Edwards, why don't you start?
As new laws are passed, don't we just adopt those and can we make reference to that rather than, spending a whole bunch of time on it? We gotta follow the law anyway.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I'm having trouble hearing Josh in the room, but I think that's me on to answer that question. Yes, we do periodic updates occasionally to meet changes in state law, but the changes that fall into this are specific to the Growth Management Act. So we're really focused on changes that have happened to the RCW 3670A, to the planning goals, and to development regulation requirements under that specific piece of law. So we do periodic updates like there was a recent one for the boundary line adjustment project that came through, and we'll do short updates to code changes if we need to meet changes in state law. Most of the comp plan updates kind of get kicked to that periodic update and folded into there. A lot of the big changes just came through in 2021 and 2022, so they're fairly recently changed.
This is a follow-up to Commissioner Edwards, so you can't just say incorporate by reference the law. You have to go in and, can you describe what you need to do in terms of the plan with that new legal change? You have to go in and rewrite narrative sections or provide local data that backs up. What is it what is the task at hand when the legislature says, here's a new thing you have to do?
Yeah, it's all of those things, Commissioner Menser. So there is narrative that needs to be changed, there's new data that needs to be incorporated, and then there's policies that we either need to remove, add, or revise. So I'll use the housing element as an example. That has had lots of major changes. They totally rewrote the planning goal around housing. So we have to plan for additional segments of the population that we were not previously planning for, and also plan for additional types of housing that we were not planning for. So there's a lot of new pieces that we were not already covering in the plan that need to be update and added. And there's a lot of new data that feeds into that I think the Housing Authority, but Commerce is still coming out with guidance around that. So we'll be getting that data from other groups and departments, and then that will feed into those updates in the plan.
Yeah,
Related to that, is it fair to say that state law tell us what to do, what we need to do, and the comp plan that we need to go through is how we need to do it? Related to the local jurisdictions, to our local population.
Absolutely, that's a fair assessment.
Because the state law is, this is the one. What we need to do now with the change in the state law, and this is the minutia, my words, in terms of how to achieve that objective.
The vision and how to achieve.
but just as an example, predictable permitting, bullet 7 there on page 5. The legislature right now is
Is it
contemplating
Yeah.
putting in place, you got 30 days to get your permit out. You don't get it out, the application becomes the permit. So, I mean, that's pretty simple to just say, and we'll follow state law, RCW 1 and 2, and
Well,
issue
that's the,
within
those are
30
the, those are
days.
the brackets, right? If that bill
Yeah.
passes, those are the brackets, then internally, we need to develop a process to how we're gonna be
Well, just-
meeting that intent.
Yes, but just add it to it, get her done, you know. Some won't get done, permit will become the application. I like it, I'd like to have it 10 days.
So I have a question about on the list of written public comment ideas. One of the ones on there that I also heard talk to some citizens about was the how this connects to our countywide planning policies. And the argument was made to me that your comp plan, like the countywide planning policies are developed amongst the jurisdictions and they set the highest level vision. And then the individual jurisdictions do comp plans that are supposed to be consistent. And if you go in and you update your comp plan without updating the countywide planning policy, you risk creating bigger gaps, and those gaps then create litigation risk because I've seen, growth management litigation where the argument is you're not doing stuff consistent with your planning, your comp plan is not consistent with your countywide planning policies or what you did on the ground is inconsistent with the countywide planning policy. We've seen that in litigation threat letters from FutureWise, for example. So I guess my question is, in this whole process, do we risk something by updating, and I know we have to update the county, I know we have to update the comp plan, but I guess my question is, what's the schedule by which we have to update the countywide planning policies? Is there a state law that mandates that? And if there isn't, is there a best practice as to how we do that as it relates to when you're updating your comp plan, so you're not creating gaps?
Chris, do you care to touch on this at all since you sat in a meeting with the other jurisdictions?
So hopefully the mic's picking me up. So you're right, we do need to meet those countywide planning policies. So one of the first things that is done, especially as we go through a comprehensive plan update, is look at those countywide planning policies and see, do we need to start this process? And we did that. We do not believe we need to, at this point in time, update those countywide planning policies. Now, that does not necessarily mean after all of the jurisdictions complete their comprehensive plan updates, we may need to go back and make specific changes to those countywide planning policies, especially where we talk about housing, to make sure that everybody is in alignment once all of the cities and the county completes their visioning process
for that, so that we're all on the same page. That's to help us make sure that we're consistent in our application of land use in our urban growth areas.
So just to confirm, you've met with the other jurisdictions, and the consensus is that the gap between the comp plans and the countywide planning policies is not significant enough at this time to address the countywide planning policy.
That's correct.
Thank you. And then the corollary to that is implicit in that answer is that we can control that process. The state law doesn't say we have to, the state law say we have to have countywide planning policies, but we can update them at our own leisure.
We do
Or-
have to have kind of.
Planning policies per Washington State growth management laws. But how and when we do those updates is based on the jurisdictions.
It doesn't have this schedule. the
It
way-
does not have that schedule, correct.
Go back to Commissioner.
When we're covering things like, I'm going back to page 5, there might be a conflict because the state's coming out with ADU regulatory stuff, and we've created new regulatory stuff, and I don't know, it probably conflicts with reducing sprawl. So is that where we start making adjustments to address that?
So on that page, you'll recall that Maya did say that this is where the balancing act
Yeah.
is, that some of these items may be in conflict with one another, and that's where local jurisdictions get to decide what you and the community is balancing towards.
And then you make reference to property rights. I don't think the county ever does kind of watch for our constitutional property rights in the state of Washington's constitution. Could that be referred to, that we're gonna go by the state constitution? Because there's a lot of stuff in there that we push the envelope on property rights. And nobody likes to sue City Hall, so to speak, because it's not very profitable.
Maya,
I'd like to
Chris,
see it adjusted, that we actually reference our state constitution and intend on following it.
in goal number 6, where is our comp plan in addressing that?
Yeah, thank you, Josh, for reiterating the question. So we do have general policies around property rights and protecting those for landowners in the comprehensive plan. And the rubber really meets the road in the terms of the development code and what people can do on their property. But we can certainly look into including references to state law as part of the policy language that's in the plan with this update.
And on 6, on economic development, do we get input from the EDC and other affected entities, Chamber of Commerce, those business groups? Do they have an input here? I mean, can they write a letter and say, hey, you guys take way too long on your permitting process?
So if you'll recall, this is one of those places where you've asked for us to contract out and have professional services in the past. The Economic Development Council was our external contractor that wrote the economic development chapter in our last update. So yes, I'd say they have a high degree of input in that chapter.
I've got a question about budgeting. I understand what you say about 690, $210,000 down, potential $700,000 grant.
Right.
But when we rely on this grant being available, and we at some point think we're gonna pay all of this out of general fund, and if you budgeted for this, update that. How does this fit in terms of, sounds like this $700,000 is kind of,
It is new from the legislature. It had been contemplated for a few years now. And in 2022 is when they enacted that funding under the budgeting from the state. So typically, we end up having to, through general funds, paying either a professional services to complete some of these pieces or specific pieces of research, and then staff takes that research and incorporates that into the overall comprehensive plan update. You'll notice that with contracting funding and with funding for contract and without funding for contract, there's a difference between the FTEs. So with the legislature granting us this funds, we actually can rely we can use less staff time in actually preparing the comprehensive plan and use that staff time somewhere else, a specific land use amendment or anything like that. Had we not gotten that grant, the majority, actually, all of our staff would have been doing the comprehensive plan update in order to meet the timeframes.
And so let me also just kind of piggyback on that. Thank you, Chris. That's a conversation that counties had been having with the state for a long time, is you have us do these periodic updates, but you don't fund them. And so we were tracking that legislation as it was moving through during the previous session, and we factored that in when it got passed into the planning process. We presumed that the board would be able to follow the timeline to get us to that scope of work, to be able to apply for the grant. Our presumption, based on the legislation, is that we will receive $700,000 when we apply for it. So the answer to your question is yes, it's part of our planning process, but no, we don't have it yet because there are requirements, and most of those are based on the timelines for the local jurisdictions.
That was an example in 2022 to address the concern of outfunded mandate.
Exactly.
Correct.
In the GMA and all the regulations was an outfunded mandate. And the legislature in a way did an attempt to do this.
Yep.
But as you said, it's a requirement because I believe each jurisdiction needs to be serious on the update. And the seriousness of the update is passing a legislative action, which is a resolution.
That's right.
And as soon as the board considers passing a resolution, I believe, so nothing is 100% with the state, but it's pretty much sure that money will be given to the county.
That's right. And that's why that timeline on page 23 is so important.
So I would characterize it as we're on the hook for about $910,000 worth of work. That would have come out of our existing budget or become a budget request in some form to the board. Now with the money from the state, we're gonna get an additional $700,000 in revenue, and the 210 is what's in our existing budget.
Yeah.
That enables us to continue work on the document items.
That's a good way to characterize it. Thank you.
You could have added staff, you could still add staff to work on this and have more staff continue on the docket, but we can absorb this and expect it to absorb it in the current budget.
Yeah, because if anything like this, it requires, the option rule is 220,000, but the state is the requirement of the state, we would have been in the bag for 690,000. So, and that is, I believe, is an attempt for the state to address their funding mandates in a way. And I believe the $210,000 is for professional services. And that is probably even for you as a board have discussed bringing consultants to help us navigate through the complex issues. And I believe the staff is looking into that possibility as we move forward. Professional services, bring those consultants to help us move forward this process.
That's right.
Just to finish, kind of, I wasn't so much thinking about staff as consultants, I was just more looking at the fact that the board has to make choices on the optional items. If they were potentially going to pay $700,000, other committees to do everything, $200,000, because we're going to state money we would expect.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Trying to just minimize the task at hand because every dollar's coming in the general.
That's right.
Anyway, Commissioner Edwards.
You made mention that during the survey, there were 950 respondents, but 84 were written. What does that mean? How were the 950, how did they come in versus the 84 that were written? Are you talking about snail mail or email? What are we talking about?
So those are, yep, I heard that one. Thank you. Those were two separate ways that we took in public feedback. The survey was entirely separate from those written comments. That was an online survey that went out to the community. We shared it through Facebook, through our email list, and that was the 950 responses. It was just a form survey that people filled out. And there were some written responses that we got as part of that. I think we got about 400 written responses that came in through that survey. survey. The 84 written public comments are just emails and snail mail that has come to me or to the board directly requesting that specific updates be included or pieces of the scope of work be reviewed. So two separate metrics, it's kind of additive. They don't take away from each other. They're in addition to each other.
When we get comment by email, do we make any attempt at verifying, the IPO address or anything to make sure that one person isn't sending in 10 comments, that type of thing? Do we have any mechanism in place that'll, raise a flag? Hey, this guy's, commented, 27 times. He's trying to influence.
Yeah, we don't use IP address or anything, but we can tell when someone submits multiple times, and that has been a case with the written comments because folks want to submit 5 comments on 5 different topics, and that just occasionally happens. So as part of the process, I could do unique commenter ID moving forward, but because people touch on different themes through separate emails, I will try to think of useful ways to convey that information. For the survey, we did have IP address as a tool, and there was, I think we actually had 998 responses, and one person who had submitted 48 responses of all the same thing. So we filtered those out. So we did take that into consideration for the form survey that was filled out.
Only have a few minutes. I wanted to ask about that land use, future land use thing you were talking about. So
Mhm.
I guess my question is, so the example you gave about there's a residential set of land use projects, 1 to 20, 1 to 10. Somebody wanted to go from one category to the other. You talked about it going to the hearing examiner, but what would be the criteria? What would be the criteria by which that decision would be made? I mean, obviously, you can't just have everyone, going down to the lowest, amount, and you've got density requirements and blah 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 blah. I mean, how can we decide whether to let somebody do that?
Hey, Maya, on that question, are those parameters set, or is that what this conversation would be? Is what our community wants those parameters to be?
We would probably have to review that a bit more. The parameters do exist in not only the comprehensive plan, but the development code, but that would be looked at a little bit further. And so essentially the hearing examiner has to make a decision based on the principles that are in the comprehensive plan and in the development code. And so we would be reviewing those as part of that update. But there is still a public hearing as part of that process. It is not without public outreach. There is a mailing notice to neighbors in the vicinity. But yes, Josh, you're correct. We would be reviewing the guiding principles for that as part of that sort of an update.
So it needs more work. We don't know yet. We'd have to look at it.
Yeah, I mean,
That's what this would do.
I don't usually oppose quicker and better not always better, but quicker processes as long as the substance is, as long as it's not an end run around things that are important. So if the same principles can be upheld within a more streamlined, quicker, cheaper process for the applicant, great.
Yeah.
But it wasn't clear to me from what you described how that would work. So I would need more information about how the mechanics of that something like that work.
Us too. That's what the work would be.
I just have one quick question. This morning we received a letter from the chair of the planning commission. And that's dated February 1st.
Correct.
And just of this letter, as I read it, they want to be involved in the scoping process and everything else.
Correct.
And I believe you had the first work session on February 15th. So I assume that's a direct response to the letter from the planning commission. So in a way, we have heard the planning commission and the staff is working and making sure they are engaged in this process.
That's correct. And we're working to help delineate what their request is, given that we have required chapters and then we have the optional chapters. And we're interested to hear which optional chapters they as a commission want to engage in and what their priorities on those optional chapters might be.
There is a separation of duties in a way.
That's right.
This is a legislative action. And hopefully we have that also understanding with the planning commission.
That is a continual work in process, and that's our hope, is to bring their input back to the board, and then the board makes a decision on how they want to engage further.
One nice thing about the planning commission actually citizen involvement is, they're a big piece of citizen involvement.
That's
in the
right.
whole process.
We appreciate their work.
So, following up on the county manager, and the question I had is like, you have a list of like major themes of folks, what they would like to see, and then somehow that translated into later in the presentation, like, here are your optional chapters. And I guess I'm just wondering, how do those connect? I mean, when I read what the public comment want, they all seem really good and really important to me, so I'm just wondering, how did that translate into what you're presenting to the board as our choices for optional chapters? Did some of these things just not appropriate, environmental justice or racial disparity or farmland preservation, or you've got climate, I know is a possibility, you've got housing. So those are two that directly translate into an optional chapter, but then some of these other ones, how do they fit essentially?
Someone else speaking, or can I go?
Go for it, Maya. That's a good question.
Thank you. That's a great question, Commissioner Menser. So a lot of these, even though they're not clearly the title of an element, they're already folded into the required updates that we're going to have to do. So addressing racial disparities, that's also a piece of the housing element updates. The environmental justice priority, that is something that we can start considering in the comp plan without having a specific optional update included. It's kind of a theme that we don't need a separate chapter on. Farmland preservation falls under the natural resources element requirement, so we'll be doing updates around that. We took the big themes that were not already in some of the required elements and we included them as an optional updates. So the climate, the measurable metrics, which translates into the implementation plan, and those were the two big ones really. The rest of them are kind of covered in the required updates. The only other one is the updates to the countywide planning policies, which Chris said we reviewed and we don't see changes are needed, but we still have the flexibility to go back and adjust those if we determine that there are changes needed following the periodic updates and the work that comes out of this.
So it might not have a specific chapter name to it, but the concept is that the board and the planning commission and the staff would roll those into the elements that you
Here's
decide
another
upon.
one to think about. It was suggested to me in the salmon recovery work that local salmon recovery plans get rolled into as elements of our comprehensive plan. And I don't know how that would work, if it would fit in, but I'd like you to just noodle on that and see if there's a way you think something like that fits. And if it does, we can help that later. Commissioner Edwards, any closing?
Yeah, maybe one last thing is let's tell both sides of the story on every issue. So whether that's rushing the permit process or EVs, making electric batteries. What's the real impact here? I see we're gonna have a battery plant in Michigan. So there's a downside, the environmental damage of making the battery. There's a benefit of driving the electric vehicle. So I'd like to have both sides when there's any type of a controversy on anything. Wind power, what's it take to build one of those things? How long do they last?
Thank you for your input.
County manager, final comment?
So, just one comment, I just checked House Bill 1717, that is the total participation, I don't think it's made it to the House bill yet. So we'll keep an eye on that particular bill to see how that's gonna work out.
So House Bill 1717 was adopted by the legislature last year, or the year before?
Last year or this year?
That was last year. So it is part of the requirements that,
So 2022.
Remember 17 years.
Yeah. But either way, we are engaging with the tribes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, we gotta wrap this up.
Yep.
April
April 12th, the next briefing of this commission, so in the meantime, please look at it, the optional items that you would like to continue conversation.
Okay, very good job. Thank you, Maya. Thank you, Chris.
Thanks, Maya.
For the work session,